I wasn't out that night for any dramatic reason. I'd gone to my sister's place in the next village to help her move a chest freezer into the shed, stayed longer than I meant to, had tea, then one beer because her husband insisted it was already open. And by the time I left, it was later than I judged from the kitchen clock. Their car was blocked in behind a trailer. Nobody was in any state to drive me, and the road between her village and mine was one I'd walked plenty of times since I was a teenager. It was a little over 3 miles if I took the lane past the old mill and then cut along the long straight road by the fields. Not pleasant in the dark, but not unusual either. I had my phone in my coat pocket, 20% battery, weak signal out there, and a small torch on my keys that worked if you hit it against your palm. I remember all of that because I've gone over the walk so many times since, trying to locate the point where it changed from an ordinary thing into something I still don't know how to place in my head. It was one of those damp nights that aren't quite raining, but make everything feel coated. The hedges held the moisture, and the road shone in strips where the tar was exposed between patches of mud from tractor tires. There wasn't much wind. Every now and then, I could hear water moving in the ditch beside the lane, and once or twice an owl somewhere far off. Mostly, it was very still. Not the kind of stillness people describe as oppressive, just the normal sort you get in the countryside once everybody's indoors and there are no cars for long stretches. I could see only a little of the road ahead. There was a light mist sitting low over the fields, enough to soften the edges of gates and telegraph poles, but not enough to hide them completely. My breath didn't steam much, so it wasn't that cold. I remember thinking I should have worn a hat. The first part of the walk was exactly what it always was. I went down the slope from my sister's house, past the chapel with the dark windows, and the war memorial that always looks like somebody standing there if you catch it from the side, then turned onto the smaller lane that leads out toward the mill. My shoes were making a regular sound on the road, not loud, just that flat, slightly sticky sound of rubber soles on damp tarmac with the occasional grit crunch where dirt had been washed across. I was thinking about something stupid at first, whether I'd left my gloves on her radiator. I even took my phone out and nearly texted her to check, then put it back to save the battery. I noticed the other sound because it seemed to arrive a fraction after mine, not immediately after every step, just often enough to separate itself from the background. A small, dry scuff, as if someone behind me was walking carefully and not lifting their feet properly. At first, I folded it into the rest of the noises without really paying attention. If you walk alone at night, especially on a road you know well, your ears make patterns out of things. Water drips, your coat sleeve rubs, a loose lace taps your ankle, and for a few steps it becomes something else until your brain sorts it out. I assumed it was that. I listened for a bit without turning around and decided it was probably my own left shoe catching on the road at a different angle. Then, I forgot it. A little farther on, as the lane narrowed between 2 tall hedges, I heard it again, more distinctly. My step, then another, not matching exactly. Near enough to echo me, but not near enough to be one. It came from behind and slightly to the left. I stopped. In that kind of silence, stopping feels larger than it should. My own body seemed to move against the quiet for a second or two after I'd already gone still. My coat settled. I heard the water in the ditch, a faint ticking from the cooling engine of a parked van somewhere behind the hedge near the last house. Then nothing. I turned and looked back along the lane. There was no one there. The road dipped gently and then disappeared into the pale mist. No torch beam, no shape, no movement. Just wet black road and hedge. I waited maybe 10 seconds, feeling a little embarrassed at myself. Then I walked on. For a minute or so, there was only the sound of my own pace again. I told myself that was proof enough. Then, right as I began to relax, I heard the trailing scuff once more. This time it came after my third step, and then not again until my sixth. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was making it couldn't be bothered to keep a consistent rhythm. I stopped again, more suddenly, and felt that small rush of adrenaline people get when they think they might be about to catch someone watching them. I turned around quickly enough that if there had been a person close behind, I should have seen them shift or freeze or do something human. There was still no one. The road behind me looked the same. Empty, damp, half lost in that low haze. I said, "Hello?" and immediately hated how flat and ordinary my voice sounded out there. No answer came back, not even a dog barking from some distant yard. There are practical explanations your mind reaches for because it prefers them. I thought of an animal first. A dog loose from one of the farms, maybe pacing the hedge. Then I noticed the sound had the wrong weight, not paws in the grass or the rough skitter of claws. It really did sound like a shoe dragging very slightly on wet road. I walked again, a little slower, paying attention now. My own steps were steady. Right, left, right, left. The other sound didn't sit neatly between them. It came after one step, then disappeared, then returned behind the next two. Whenever I focused too hard on it, it seemed to go faint. When I let my attention drift, it crept back. By the time I reached the old mill bridge, I was irritated more than frightened. The bridge has low stone sides and a narrow channel underneath where the stream runs quicker, so sounds change there. I thought I'd settle it by listening in a place where echoes behaved differently. I crossed to the middle, stopped dead, and waited. For a second, I heard only the stream under the stones and a bit of reed movement down in the dark. Then, very softly, from somewhere behind me on the bridge, there was one single step. Not loud, not dramatic, just the ordinary sound of a shoe coming down on damp stone. I turned so fast I nearly slipped. Nothing, no person, no dog, no shadow moving away. The bridge was empty from one side to the other, and because the stone walls were low, I could see the dark grass banks below as well. If somebody had crouched, I'd have seen them. If they'd jumped the wall, I'd have heard them. There was nowhere for anything full size to be hidden on that bridge. I stood there longer than I should have. My heart had started going too quickly, but the rest of me felt very still, as if I'd stepped into a colder patch of air. I told myself very calmly that I had just heard a delayed echo. Stone, water, enclosed space, odd acoustics. It isn't even a bad explanation. If somebody else told me the same thing now, I'd probably suggest it myself. The only problem is that the sound hadn't been shaped like an echo. It had been too small, too near, and too singular. Not a reflection of my last step, a new one. I left the bridge and kept going because standing there felt worse than moving. The road after the mill opens into a long stretch with fields on either side and only a few scattered trees. There are no houses for nearly a mile. On a clear night, you can see the lamps of the main road in the distance, but the mist had thickened enough that night to blur everything beyond maybe 30 yards. The hedges were lower there, and I could smell wet earth from the plowed field on my right. Somewhere out in it, there was a metal sheet or gate catching and releasing with a tiny clink as it moved in the breeze. My pace changed without me meaning it to. I walked faster, then slower, then faster again, as if by altering the rhythm I could expose the other sound. For a while, it didn't come. I began to think the bridge had simply unsettled me, and now every ordinary noise was going to feel loaded. I even laughed once, quietly, mostly to hear a human sound. Then I heard it again, right behind my own next step. So close this time that I felt it more than heard it. A second placement of weight, where my own had just gone. I stopped. The extra step came a beat later. That was the first moment I genuinely felt afraid. It wasn't like the fear you get from seeing something obvious and threatening. It was smaller and worse than that because it required a second to understand. I had stopped moving. I knew with absolute certainty that my feet were planted. And yet, after I stopped, there was still one more footfall, soft and careful, as if someone had taken advantage of my pause to close the distance by a single pace. I looked over my shoulder rather than turning fully, and for a moment, I had the very strong impression that if I turned all the way around, I would catch something too close to me, almost touching the back of my coat. That feeling was so clear and so irrational that it froze me in place more effectively than any actual sight could have. Eventually, I did turn, because you have to. There was nothing there. The road behind me lay empty. The mist had brightened slightly with the hidden moon, enough to make the white line at the edge of the road appear and vanish. I listened until my ears hurt with it. No breath except mine. No shift in the hedge. No retreating steps. I tried to think sensibly. I told myself that the delayed sound could still be mine, somehow. Wet road, strange surface, sound reflecting off the hedges, the bridge making me jumpy. I stamped one foot hard. The noise came back at once from the hedge to my left, duller than the original. I stamped again. Another echo, but again, not quite right. I could hear the difference, and that made me feel both better and worse, because it proved the lane could throw my own steps back at me, but not in the way I had been hearing. I started walking again, deliberately slow. Left, right, left, right. Nothing. Then, after 5 or 6 steps, left, right, and another right that wasn't mine. I tried an experiment I'm not proud of now because it makes me sound like I had too much time to think, but fear often makes you methodical in strange ways. I altered my stride. I took 2 quick steps and 1 slow one. My own body did it awkwardly, and I could feel the tension in my hips as I forced the pattern. The sound behind me followed, but not perfectly. It copied the shape of the rhythm a moment later, as though something had heard what I was doing and was trying to reproduce it from memory. That bothered me more than the continued step after I stopped. A random sound can fall into your pace by chance. A real person can match you on purpose. But this had the quality of imitation without understanding. If someone were mocking the way you waved your hand, but getting the joints slightly wrong. I stopped again. 3 seconds passed. Then one soft step came from directly behind me. I moved off the road onto the muddy verge so quickly my shoe slid. The grass was wet up to my ankles. I stood there, no longer caring how silly I might look if a car happened by, and stared at the black strip of road. If there were a person behind me, they would have had to step onto the road to keep close. There was no one on it. I became aware then of my own breathing as a separate problem. It had gone shallow and irregular. I took a few slow breaths to steady myself. That's when I noticed that my heartbeat seemed to be affecting the sound, not matching it, influencing it. Whenever I held my breath and listened inward, the road seemed to answer with that faint tread a second later, as if some part of me had been heard and repeated outside. I know how that sounds. At the time, I didn't phrase it to myself that way. I just knew I was beginning to lose track of what belonged to the world and what belonged to my body. The line between those two things, which you rely on without ever thinking about it, had started to blur. There was still over a mile to my house. Going back would have meant retracing the same road, and I couldn't make myself do that. Forward, at least, meant an end point. I told myself I would keep walking until I reached the first farmhouse, and if the feeling hadn't passed by, then I'd wake someone and ask for a lift or at least stand under a porch light until I felt less ridiculous. So I continued. But now, every step was work. The dark no longer looked neutral. The hedges seemed full of withheld detail. The field on my right had a patch where the mist sat lower, and I couldn't stop imagining something moving within it at my speed, staying level with me. I never actually saw anything. That's important. Even now, remembering it, I can say honestly that I did not see a person or a shape or anything supernatural by the roadside. All of it was sound, and the way sound changed the space around me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly cried out from the shock of it. It was just my sister, asking if the gloves were mine. I answered too quickly with clumsy fingers, "Yes, keep them," and thought about calling her then and there, just to have a voice in my ear. But the signal bar was flickering on and off, and a stronger feeling stopped me. I didn't want to speak to anyone while I was hearing that other step. I didn't want to make it more real by trying to describe it out loud. I put the phone back and kept moving. The farmhouse lights appeared ahead at last, yellow and low through the mist, and I felt immediate relief. Not because I intended to knock, but because having a lit building in view rearranged the world into something more ordinary. There was a cattle grid before the gate, and as I approached it, I had another idea. A grid makes a very distinct sound underfoot. If the extra step were some echo or trick of the road, it would show itself there. I crossed slowly. My soles rang on the metal bars, each step sharp and hollow. Halfway across, just behind me, I heard the same metal note return, but wrong. Not under the weight of a foot from behind. Under mine, as if after I lifted each foot, some other pressure briefly tested the place it had left. I stepped off the grid and nearly stumbled again. Then I did something I wish I hadn't done, because it gave me the one clear image I can't get rid of. I turned on the key torch and crouched, aiming the weak beam at the grid. The bars were wet and shining. Nothing stood on them. No shadow cut the light. But on the bar where my left foot had just been, the water trembled in a footprint shape. Not a splash, not droplets falling from my sole. A shallow oval disturbance, like the metal itself had remembered the contact a second too late. The torch shook in my hand so badly, the light jittered. I stood up, switched it off immediately, because the little pool of brightness made me feel exposed, and walked on without looking back. Not ran. I know people always say they ran, but I didn't. Something about running seemed to invite that sound to catch up. I walked as fast as I could without breaking into it, arms tight at my sides, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. The footsteps changed then. Until that point, they had lagged, sometimes by one beat, sometimes by more. As I moved past the farmhouse, they began to drift closer to my own rhythm. Not perfectly in step, nearly. Sometimes they landed at the same time as mine, making my own footfall seem thicker, doubled. Sometimes they arrived a hair early, which was worse. It made it feel like the road knew what I was about to do. I passed the farmhouse gate and saw no movement in the yard. There was a porch light on and a blue tractor under a lean-to, but no dog barked, no curtain twitched. The ordinariness of it all became almost offensive. I wanted some interruption. A person coming out with a torch asking if I was all right. Headlights on the road. Anything to break the private logic that had formed around me. Instead, the world remained completely indifferent. Half a mile farther on, the road bends by a row of ash trees and then rises slightly toward the village boundary sign. The mist gathered thicker there among the trunks. I couldn't see the tops of the trees at all, only the lower black shapes and the pale road threading between them. That was where the sound became intimate. It's difficult to explain that without sounding dramatic. I don't mean louder. I mean nearer in the way your own body is near. The extra steps no longer seemed to come from the road behind me. They felt as if they were happening just inside the space I occupied, almost under my shoulders, almost at the base of my neck. Every time I put my foot down, It was like feeling an afterimage of movement continue through me and settle a half-second later. I stopped again, because by then stopping had become a compulsion. I needed to know whether the rule still held. It did. I stood motionless in the mist, and behind my stillness, within it, just after it, came one more soft step. I actually said, "No," quietly, the way you might correct someone in conversation. Then I said, louder, "Who's there?" My voice went out into the trees and died almost at once. No answer. Only that damp silence and, somewhere overhead, a single drip from a branch. I thought then of turning around and walking backward for a bit, just to face whatever might be making the sound. I even tried it. I took one careful step backward while looking straight ahead down the road I'd come from. Nothing. Another step. Nothing. Then, as I shifted my weight for a third, I heard a footfall in front of me. I can still feel what happened in my stomach at that. It was not like being startled. It was like having a rule of space removed. I spun at once and shone the torch ahead. The beam caught only mist, hedge, and the white edgeline of the road, but the sound had been unmistakably in front, a pace or two ahead, as though whatever had been imitating me behind had, in the act of my turning, slipped through my position and gone on before. I don't know how long I stood there. Time out there lost its proper size. I remember thinking, with weird clarity, that if I made myself sick from panic, I'd have to walk home covered in it. That sort of practical, stupid thought was all that kept me tied to something normal. Eventually I moved again, very carefully. The footsteps returned, but now they seemed to shift around me. Behind for a few paces, then beside, then nowhere I could place, only the sense of an extra movement adhering to mine. It felt like when you've worn someone else's glasses and the world doesn't line up properly. My own walking no longer felt singular. The road surface changed near the boundary sign from rough tar to a smoother, patched stretch the council had redone the year before. The different texture should have altered the sound of my steps. It did alter mine. It didn't alter the other ones at all. That more than anything convinced me they were no longer external in any ordinary sense. The imitation had detached from the road. I became careful about my body in ways I'd never been before. I noticed how my shoulders swung slightly, how my right foot angled outward more than my left, how my knees didn't quite straighten. Each tiny imperfection seemed suddenly important, because I had the growing impression that something was learning me by repetition, not from a distance, from contact, like a pressure molding itself to the way I moved. By the time the first houses of my village showed through the mist, my fear had changed. I was no longer waiting to see someone or something. I was trying not to arrive at a conclusion that had been edging toward me for the last mile. I wanted streetlights, doors, curtains, anything human. The houses there are set back from the road with small front gardens and low stone walls. Most of the windows were dark. A television flickered blue in one sitting room. Somewhere, a boiler started up with a muted thump. Normal sounds, comforting, almost enough to make me ashamed. Then, I reached the village sign at the bend and stopped under the lamp beside it. The lamp was old sodium, that murky orange kind. Not bright, but brighter than anything I'd had so far. My shadow fell long across the road. For the first time all night, I could see myself clearly enough to feel located in my own body again. Damp coat, jeans muddy at the hem, one shoelace partly loose. I stood in that dirty orange light and decided I would settle it once and for all. I would stand absolutely still and watch my own shadow. If I heard the step continue, then either there was something visible that cast with me, or there wasn't. Either way, I'd have something concrete. So I planted both feet, folded my arms tight against the cold, and looked at the shadow. It was mine. Head, shoulders, torso, legs, nothing else attached to it. It quivered slightly with my breathing. Then, just behind me, very close, came one more footstep. At the same moment, in front of me on the road, my shadow made a small forward jerk, as if I had begun to walk. I had not moved. I know that with the same certainty, I know my own name, but my shadow shifted. Not much. The amount it would shift if you let your weight move onto one foot in preparation for the next step. I felt the muscles in my right leg tense a heartbeat after seeing it, not before. That was the realization. Not sudden in the sense of surprise, because some part of me had been circling it for a while. Sudden in the sense that everything else fell away around it and left it standing there alone. The extra footsteps were not following me in the way a person follows another person. They were arriving from the part of me that moves before I know I've decided to move. They were not separate. They were either ahead of me or behind me inside the same act. An imitation, yes, but not of my body as I experience it. Of something slightly earlier, slightly later, slightly misaligned beneath it. I don't know if that sounds coherent. Standing under that lamp, it made a terrible kind of sense. I understood, in one clean and awful instant, that if I kept testing it, if I kept stopping and listening, it would go on proving itself until I had no distance left between what I did and what it repeated. I walked home without stopping again. That last stretch from the sign to my house is only 5 minutes. I know every gate and pothole on it. I didn't look left or right. I didn't check behind. I kept my eyes on my front door at the end of the row and listened to the rhythm under me as little as possible. But once you've recognized a pattern, you can't unhear it. There was my step, and threaded through it, another placement of weight that sometimes lagged and sometimes anticipated. At one point, they matched so closely I felt sick, as if I might suddenly feel a hand on my own shoulder from the inside. I got to the house, fumbled the key in the lock twice, and went in. The hall light was on because I'd left it that way. I closed the door, locked it, put the chain across, and stood with my forehead against the wood. The silence indoors was different at once. Familiar. Boxed. Safe, I thought. I remember that exact word. Safe. Then from the other side of the hall, not from outside the door, I heard a single step on the tile near the kitchen. It was so ordinary a sound that for a moment I couldn't place why it was impossible. A shoe coming lightly down on ceramic. Not a creak from the house settling. Not a pipe. I lifted my head and looked toward the kitchen doorway. The light there was off. The space beyond it was black. Nothing came out. No second step followed. No movement. I stood for what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably less than one, listening so hard my ears rang. Eventually, I forced myself to turn every light on in the house. Kitchen, sitting room, upstairs landing, bathroom. I checked every room. Cupboards, behind doors, under the bed like a child. There was no one. All the windows were latched from the inside. The back door was locked. The place smelled faintly of dust and radiator heat and the apples in the bowl by the sink. Completely normal. I didn't sleep much. Every time I began to drift, I became aware of my own body making the small adjustments bodies make in bed. Ankle shifting against sheet, shoulders settling deeper into the mattress, breath changing, and I'd jolt awake waiting for a second version of the movement. Once, around 3, I did hear something from downstairs, a soft tick, then what might have been the wood in the hall contracting. I lay there until dawn and told myself I was not hearing footsteps, not because I believed it, but because I needed to get through the remaining dark. The next morning, everything was almost easy to dismiss. Daylight does that. I walked the same route in my mind and found sensible answers for each part. The bridge, the hedges, the cattle grid, the mist, my nerves, the beer, the late hour, the way loneliness on a rural road can magnify the smallest irregularity until it acquires intention. By lunchtime, I'd mostly convinced myself that what frightened me most had not been any actual sound, but the suggestion that my own senses could no longer be trusted. I even went outside and examined the tiles in the hall, as if they might show something. They showed nothing, of course, just my own dried marks from my shoes the night before. For a week, I avoided walking anywhere after dark. That wasn't difficult. I drove if I had to go out, and if I got home late, I parked as close to the door as possible. I didn't tell anybody the whole thing. I mentioned to my sister that the lane by the mill had felt eerie, and she laughed and said it always did. I nearly told her more, then heard how I would sound and left it there. Time passed, and like most experiences that don't fit well into ordinary life, it dulled around the edges. I kept the hall light on more often. I slept with the bedroom door shut. Those seemed like harmless concessions. I told myself that was all it was. Then, about 3 weeks later, I was at work, late, and had to walk from the overflow car park to the office annex, only a couple hundred yards across level ground, floodlit, not remotely lonely. As I crossed the painted lines of the lot, I heard my own steps on the concrete and something just after them, very faint. Almost lost under the hum of the security light, I stopped by the annex door. One more step came after. I went inside without looking back and spent the rest of the evening around other people, chatting more than usual, laughing at things that weren't especially funny, unwilling to be alone long enough to test anything. Since then, it has not happened often, which makes it worse in a way. If it were frequent, I could call it a condition, a symptom, a persistent auditory illusion, and seek help with a proper vocabulary. But it is rare and selective. It happens only when I am alone, usually at night, and only in places where my own movement can be clearly heard. An empty pavement after rain, a corridor with a hard floor, the path behind the community hall, once in the stairwell of a hotel in Leeds, where I was staying for work and had to sit in the lobby until morning because I couldn't bear to climb the last flight. Sometimes months pass with nothing. Then I'll be walking somewhere quiet, and the old pattern will begin with that faint, almost courteous extra tread. I have made rules for myself. I do not stop to test it anymore. I do not alter my stride. I do not try to catch it out by turning suddenly, or walking backward, or holding my breath. I keep moving until I reach light or company. If I can't do that, I stand where I am and make some ordinary sound, clear my throat, jingle my keys, talk aloud to myself about something mundane, because those things seem to break the pattern better than silence does. What I have never been able to decide is whether the worst part was the moment under the village lamp when I understood the footsteps were tied to me, or the later thought that followed from it. If they were only repeating me, however strangely, that would be one thing. But they didn't always repeat. Sometimes they anticipated. Sometimes the second step was the one my body seemed to obey. That is the part I don't know how to live with. Not the fear of being followed. The fear that on those nights I am slightly behind myself. I still walk that road in daylight from time to time. There's nothing unusual about it. The mill bridge is old but sound. The hedges are hedges. The cattle grid hums under tires and boots. Under sun it all collapses back into geography. Yet every now and then, when I'm coming home in the evening and the lane ahead looks emptier than it should, I feel a reluctance that has nothing to do with ghosts or village stories. It feels more personal than that, like returning to a place where I was briefly not the first version of my own movement. The strongest moment since that night happened last winter. There had been a light frost, and I'd gone out to bring the bins in after 10 because I'd forgotten. The pavement in front of the house was silvered over and hard. I took the 2 bins back through the gate, wheeled them into place, and as I turned to go inside, I heard footsteps coming up behind me on the pavement. Calm, measured, unhurried. Not many. 3, maybe 4. I stood with one hand on the gate. The old rule came back to me, and I nearly broke it. I nearly stopped completely and listened for the extra one. Instead, I kept moving through the gate toward the door. The steps continued behind me, matching the distance exactly, neither gaining nor falling back. At the doorstep, I made myself look down, not back. There was frost on the path, thin enough to mark. From the gate to the step, there was one line of footprints. Mine, I assumed, until I saw that each print held 2 pressures. The usual heel and ball from the way I walk, and laid within them, just offset enough to notice a second use of the same space. Not bigger, not smaller, not a separate person's track crossing mine. More like each step had been corrected while still fresh. I went inside and didn't go out again until full daylight. By then, the frost had lifted. I know there are explanations people would prefer, and maybe one of them is true. Stress, fatigue, some odd dissociation attached to movement and sound, an ear problem, a timing problem in the brain. If a doctor ever gave me a name for it, I would accept the name with gratitude. I'm not attached to mystery. I would rather be boringly unwell than uniquely haunted. But no explanation I've tried sits comfortably beside one fact. It never happens when I move among other footsteps, only when I can hear my own clearly enough for something to answer them. That's why I'm careful about certain places now. Long corridors, car parks after rain, village roads at night, stairwells after everyone else has gone to bed. It isn't darkness itself that bothers me. It's the chance of hearing the exact edge where my movement ends and the other one begins. And every so often, in bed, just before sleep, my body gives one of those harmless little settling jerks. A calf muscle loosens. My shoulder drops half an inch into the mattress. Usually that's all. Sometimes in the quiet after it, I lie very still and wait, because some nights I cannot help myself. Most nights nothing follows, but not every night. And when it does come, it is always the same. Just one soft, patient step, placed a moment after I have already stopped, as if something wearing my life has continued walking in the dark by memory alone.